Most people think the global competition between the United States and China revolves around semiconductors, aircraft carriers, and artificial intelligence. It doesn't begin there. It begins with the machine unloading your refrigerator, your laptop, your medicines, and the engine parts keeping factories alive. The modern container crane. According to multiple industry estimates, Chinese manufacturers, particularly Shanghai Zhenhua Heavy Industries, better known as ZPMC, have supplied roughly 70 to 80% of the world's ship-to-shore container cranes. In many major ports from Asia to Europe and North America, the towering red and white cranes moving millions of containers each year were designed, built, and increasingly serviced by Chinese companies. That's a remarkable statistic by itself. The more interesting question is why nobody paid much attention until recently. Because for decades, cranes were treated as industrial equipment. They're large, expensive, and difficult to manufacture, but politically unremarkable. Governments worried about oil pipelines, telecommunications networks, satellites, and undersea cables. Few policymakers spent much time asking who was building the machines lifting containers off cargo ships. Then that assumption began to change. When the U.S. House Homeland Security Committee released reports examining Chinese-built port cranes, the discussion wasn't centered on steel or engineering quality. It focused on software, remote access capabilities, maintenance systems, and the possibility, emphasis on possibility, that equipment connected to port operating networks could create vulnerabilities if relations between major powers deteriorated. Notice the shift. The concern isn't that a crane suddenly becomes a weapon. The concern is that modern infrastructure has quietly become digital infrastructure. A container crane today isn't simply a giant mechanical arm. It's packed with sensors, programmable controllers, networking equipment, positioning systems, automated diagnostics, and software updates. Every efficiency improvement ports have pursued over the past 20 years has made operations smarter and more connected. That creates an uncomfortable reality. When countries discuss supply chain resilience, they often picture factories or shipping lanes. But the supply chain has choke points. Ports are among the biggest of them. If container terminals slow down, even briefly, manufacturers wait for components, retailers wait for inventory, and consumers eventually see higher prices. The average shopper rarely thinks about cranes until store shelves become emptier or deliveries become slower. That's why this story matters far beyond maritime logistics. It's about control over bottlenecks, and bottlenecks have become one of the defining features of 21st century geopolitics. Here's the irony. China didn't achieve this position through a dramatic geopolitical master plan announced on television. It happened because Chinese firms consistently delivered cranes that were cheaper, built at enormous scale, and often financed under attractive commercial terms. Ports trying to control costs generally bought the most competitive equipment available. Markets rewarded efficiency. Politics arrived much later. There is, however, an important counterargument. Owning the manufacturing market for cranes does not automatically translate into operational control over foreign ports. Most terminals are operated by local authorities or private logistics companies. Equipment undergoes inspections, software can be isolated, and many cybersecurity experts argue that risks should be evaluated through technical evidence rather than assumption. That's a fair point, and it's worth keeping throughout this discussion. But it also misses something. Even if every individual crane operates exactly as intended, dependence itself changes strategic calculations. When one country dominates production of a critical industrial system, replacement parts, specialized maintenance, engineering expertise, and future procurement gradually concentrate around that ecosystem. That's a different kind of leverage, less dramatic, potentially more durable. Remember that figure from the beginning, roughly 3/4 of the world's ship-to-shore cranes originating from Chinese manufacturers. We'll come back to it later because the percentage itself isn't the most revealing number. The more revealing number is how long it would take the rest of the industrial world to replace that capacity if it suddenly had to. And that's where the conversation stops being about cranes at all. It becomes a story about industrial policy, manufacturing ecosystems, and whether the West slowly outsourced more than it realized. My view is straightforward. The crane debate is not evidence that every Chinese machine is a security threat. It's evidence that countries waited until dependence became visible before asking whether resilience should have been part of the purchasing decision from the beginning. I'm still not convinced policymakers have fully absorbed that lesson, because once you follow the trail behind a single crane, you eventually arrive at shipyards, steel production, financing, software, rare earths, ports, and an industrial strategy that took decades to build. That chain is much harder to replicate than the crane standing on the dock. For a long time, economists had a habit of treating ports as passive infrastructure. Ships arrived, containers moved, goods entered the economy. The port itself was simply a waypoint. That assumption no longer survives contact with reality. A modern container terminal is closer to a highly automated factory than the ports many people imagine. Every container has to be identified, scanned, assigned a location, scheduled for transport, and transferred between ships, cranes, trucks, and rail. Miss one link in that chain and congestion spreads surprisingly fast. We've already seen what that looks like. When COVID disrupted global shipping, ports from Los Angeles to Rotterdam struggled with vessel queues stretching for weeks. Hundreds of ships sat offshore while warehouses filled, trucking schedules collapsed, and retailers started running out of inventory. The cranes weren't the only problem, but they reminded everyone that logistics doesn't fail all at once. It slows down one bottleneck at a time. That experience quietly changed how governments think. Before 2020, efficiency was usually the priority. After 2020, resilience entered the conversation. Those two goals are not always compatible. China understood something that many Western economies gradually forgot. Manufacturing isn't just about making products, it's about preserving ecosystems. Take ZPMC as an example. The company didn't become the world's dominant crane manufacturer because it invented a revolutionary design. It became dominant because it sits inside an industrial environment that already produces enormous quantities of steel, heavy machinery, precision components, electrical equipment, marine engineering systems, and specialized labor. Suppliers are nearby, costs stay lower, production scales faster. That's difficult to reproduce once those ecosystems disappear. This is where industrial policy matters more than headlines. A country cannot decide on Monday that it wants to rebuild heavy manufacturing by Friday. Skilled welders need years of training. Foundries require billions of dollars in investment. Supply chains develop through thousands of companies learning to work together over decades. Factories are easier to close than ecosystems are to recreate. Europe offers an interesting comparison. Several European firms still manufacture advanced port equipment, but the market increasingly rewarded lower costs and larger production volumes. Port authorities facing budget constraints often chose the supplier offering the best commercial package. From an individual buyer's perspective, that decision made perfect sense. Collectively, those decisions concentrated production elsewhere. Markets optimized for today's balance sheet. Governments are now worrying about tomorrow's strategic position. Neither side was completely irrational. They were solving different problems. There's another layer that rarely receives attention: maintenance. Industrial equipment isn't purchased once and forgotten. A ship-to-shore crane typically operates for decades. Motors wear out, sensors need replacement, software evolves, components fail. Engineers inspect structures constantly because lifting containers weighing tens of tons leaves very little room for error. That creates long-term relationships between manufacturers and port operators. Again, this doesn't automatically imply dependence in a political sense. Ports stock spare parts, diversify suppliers where possible, and develop local expertise. But when one manufacturer dominates global installations, familiarity naturally grows around its systems. Training programs, maintenance procedures, and engineering standards begin revolving around the dominant platform. Industrial leadership becomes self-reinforcing. There's a dry irony here. For years, governments encouraged globalization because specialization made everything cheaper. Then they discovered that specialization also creates concentration. Concentration creates dependence, and dependence eventually becomes a national security discussion. Economics has an inconvenient habit of turning into geopolitics after enough time passes. Now, it's important not to oversimplify China's role. Chinese companies didn't force ports to buy their cranes. They competed aggressively on price, financing, delivery schedules, and production capacity. Many buyers were satisfied customers because the equipment performed well and arrived on time. Ignoring that commercial reality would produce a distorted picture. But commercial success and strategic consequence are not mutually exclusive. The same decision can make perfect business sense for an individual company while creating strategic questions at the national level. That's exactly what happened here. There's another example that illustrates this pattern. During the 1980s, Japan became extraordinarily competitive in automobiles and consumer electronics. American policymakers worried about industrial decline, but the concern remained largely economic. Factories moved, market share shifted, consumers enjoyed lower prices. Today's competition feels different because digital infrastructure sits inside physical infrastructure. A container crane isn't connected only to steel cables and electric motors anymore. It's connected to scheduling software, customs databases, automated inventory systems, terminal operating platforms, and increasingly, cloud-based logistics networks. Every efficiency upgrade adds another layer of connectivity. Connectivity creates productivity. It also creates new questions that previous generations never had to ask. Remember the number from part 1? The overwhelming share of global crane manufacturing held by Chinese firms? That statistic tells us who built the hardware. The more important question is, who controls the industrial capacity behind that hardware when governments decide they need alternatives? Because replacing one crane is expensive. Replacing an entire manufacturing ecosystem is something altogether different. And that's where this story starts to leave the docks and enters the broader contest over who will build the infrastructure of the next 30 years. There, quote, "It's a temptation to reduce this entire discussion to a simple headline. China built the cranes, therefore China controls the ports. That's too neat. Reality is more complicated and interesting. The ownership of a port, the ownership of the land, the company operating the terminal, and the company that manufactured the cranes are often 4 completely different entities. A container terminal in Europe might be owned by a government, operated by a private logistics company, equipped with Chinese cranes, insured by a British firm, financed by international banks, and visited daily by ships registered under half a dozen different flags. Globalization didn't create clean supply chains, it created layered ones. That distinction matters because good analysis separates potential leverage from proven control. There is public evidence that governments, particularly in the United States, have become increasingly concerned about cybersecurity risks associated with Chinese-built port equipment. There is not public evidence showing that Chinese cranes have been systematically used to sabotage foreign ports. Those are different claims. Conflating them weakens the argument instead of strengthening it. But here's where I think the conversation takes an unexpected turn. The cranes themselves may not be the biggest story anymore. The shipyards are. Look at the numbers. China now builds well over half of the world's commercial ships by gross tonnage. In some recent years, Chinese shipbuilders have accounted for more than 50% of global shipbuilding orders, while South Korea remains strong in specialized vessels, and Japan continues to play an important, though smaller, role. The United States, despite possessing one of the world's largest economies and the most powerful navy, produces only a tiny fraction of global commercial shipping. Think about what that means. If cranes are the hands of global trade, ships are the bloodstream. One without the other accomplishes very little. This is the reversal that changed my own view of the subject. I started looking into cranes. I ended up looking at industrial capacity. Because once you zoom out, the cranes stop looking like the central issue. They're simply the most visible symbol of something much larger. China spent decades building an industrial system capable of producing almost everything needed for maritime trade. Steel, heavy machinery, electric motors, precision manufacturing, shipbuilding, port equipment, rail infrastructure, even many of the containers themselves. Each sector reinforces the others. Western economies, meanwhile, optimize different parts of the value chain: software, finance, advanced services, aerospace, high-end engineering. None of those are trivial achievements. In fact, many remain global leaders. But industrial ecosystems don't disappear evenly. When enough heavy manufacturing moves elsewhere, rebuilding becomes remarkably expensive. The United States has recognized this pattern before. The CHIPS and Science Act wasn't really about semiconductors alone. It was an admission that relying entirely on overseas production for strategically important industries carries risks that traditional economic models underestimated. Europe has reached similar conclusions in batteries, critical minerals, and clean energy technologies. The common thread isn't China, it's concentration. If one country dominates production of something essential, every other country eventually starts asking the same question. What happens if access becomes uncertain? That's a strategic question, not necessarily an accusation. There's another reason this matters to ordinary people. Industrial capacity influences inflation more than most people realize. When supply chains become fragile, prices become volatile. Shipping costs rise. Manufacturers wait longer for components. Construction projects stall. Businesses carry larger inventories because they no longer trust just-in-time delivery. Every extra layer of uncertainty eventually appears in the price of everyday goods. People experience geopolitics long before they read about it, usually at the checkout counter. I also think there's a misconception that governments can simply decide to diversify overnight. They can't. Building a competitive heavy equipment manufacturer isn't like opening another software startup. It requires specialized steel production, experienced engineers, testing facilities, certification processes, long-term financing, export networks, and customers willing to trust equipment that may remain in service for 30 years. That's why industrial leadership tends to persist, not because competitors lack intelligence, because ecosystems have momentum. So here's the question I keep coming back to. If tomorrow every Western government agreed that dependence on a single supplier had gone too far, how many years would it actually take to build meaningful alternatives? 5? 10? 20? I'm not sure anyone has a convincing answer, and uncertainty in geopolitics is usually expensive. Which brings us back to that quiet statistic from the beginning. It was never really about cranes. It was about the decades of industrial choices that made those cranes almost inevitable. The final piece of the puzzle isn't whether China built the world's ports. It's why so many other countries stopped building the industries that once competed with it. Let quotes go back to the beginning. The statistic that China supplies roughly 3/4 of the world's ship-to-shore container cranes sounds dramatic. It certainly makes headlines. But after following the evidence, I don't think that's the most important number in this story. The more important number is zero. 0 countries have accidentally become industrial superpowers. China's position wasn't created by one policy or one company. It emerged from decades of deliberate decisions made by different governments, state-owned banks, provincial authorities, universities, and manufacturers that all moved broadly in the same direction. Sometimes those investments produced excess capacity. Sometimes they lost money. Sometimes they looked inefficient in the short term. But collectively, they built something remarkably difficult to copy, an industrial machine. That doesn't mean China's strategy is flawless, far from it. Its economy faces serious structural challenges. Local government debt remains high. The property sector has yet to fully recover. Demographics are moving in the wrong direction, with a shrinking working-age population likely to weigh on long-term growth. Rising labor costs mean China is no longer the cheapest manufacturing location for many industries, prompting production to shift toward countries such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico. These are real constraints. Ignoring them would be as misleading as ignoring China's manufacturing strength. The United States and its allies aren't standing still either. Washington has launched major efforts through the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act to rebuild domestic industrial capacity in semiconductors, batteries, and clean energy technologies. The European Union has introduced the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. Japan is investing heavily in semiconductor manufacturing. India is expanding production-linked incentives to attract manufacturers leaving parts of China. Something has clearly changed. Governments that spent 30 years talking almost exclusively about efficiency are increasingly talking about resilience, redundancy, and strategic autonomy. Those words rarely appeared together 20 years ago. They appear constantly today. Will that be enough? I'm skeptical. Not because rebuilding is impossible, because rebuilding takes time that political systems often struggle to sustain. Factories can be announced in press conferences. Supply chains cannot. A new steel mill still needs skilled workers. Component suppliers still need customers. Universities still need to train engineers. Shipping companies still need confidence that domestic manufacturers will be competitive 10 years from now, not just until the next election cycle. Industrial ecosystems operate on decades. Politics often operates on months. That's a difficult mismatch. There's another lesson here that extends well beyond China. Every generation assumes certain infrastructure is simply part of the background. Previous generations barely thought about oil tankers until the energy crises of the 1970s. More recently, few people cared where advanced semiconductor fabrication happened until chip shortages disrupted entire industries. Today, it's cranes. Tomorrow, it may be transformers, industrial robots, power electronics, or high-voltage transmission equipment. The pattern is familiar. We only notice strategic infrastructure after discovering how dependent we've become on it. My own conclusion is probably less dramatic than many headlines. I don't believe every Chinese-built crane represents a hidden security threat waiting to be activated. The available public evidence doesn't support such a sweeping claim. But I do believe the crane story exposed something policymakers had underestimated for years. Dependence isn't dangerous only during conflict. It changes behavior long before conflict ever begins. Countries become more cautious. Companies rethink investments. Governments spend billions trying to recreate industries they once considered obsolete. Those costs are real, even if no crisis ever materializes. That's the price of discovering that efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. Here's the question I keep asking myself. If another country, not China, just any country, controlled 3/4 of the world's port cranes, more than half of commercial shipbuilding, large portions of steel production, battery manufacturing, and critical mineral processing, would we describe that as normal globalization, or would we call it strategic concentration? I suspect the answer depends less on the data than on who holds the market share. My prediction is that this decade won't produce a complete separation between Chinese and Western supply chains. That would be extraordinarily expensive. Instead, we'll see something more subtle, selective duplication. Countries will keep trading with China while simultaneously paying a premium to build backup capacity at home. Businesses may complain about the cost, but governments increasingly view that premium as an insurance policy rather than an inefficiency. Insurance always looks expensive, right up until the day you need it. If you enjoyed this analysis, I'd appreciate you joining me for the next one. The biggest geopolitical stories usually aren't hiding in classified documents. They're often sitting in plain sight on a dock, waiting for someone to ask why they're there in the first place.